Hello and welcome to Democracies of the World, our show on Sansad TV, where we take you through the latest happenings from parliaments across the globe. In today's episode, we will talk about elections in major democracies of the world. I'm your host, Bhwana Nayar. Let's begin our show with the news coming in from Nigeria. Nigeria's Electoral Commission has declared ruling party candidate Bola Tinubu winner of the presidential vote as opposition leaders decried the polls as rigged and called for a fresh vote. Tinubu will become Nigeria's fifth elected president since 1999, winning the race for the country's top job on his first attempt. The nation held its sixth presidential election on 25th February. Let's take a look at this report. Nigeria's ruling party candidate Bola Tinubu was declared the winner of Nigeria's disputed presidential election on Wednesday. The 70-year-old veteran politician got 37% of the vote. His main rival Atiku Abubakar polled 29% and Labour's Peter Obi 25%. Their parties had earlier dismissed the poll as a sham and demanded a rerun.
Tinubu Bola Ahmed of the APC, having satisfied the requirements of the law, is hereby declared the winner and is returned elected.
Opposition parties rejected the result as the product of a flawed process which suffered multiple technical difficulties owing to the introduction of new technology by Election Commission, and on February 28 called on its own chairman, Mahmood Yakubu, to resign. Tinubu won most other states in his home region of the southwest, where he is known as political godfather who helps put others into office. He was nevertheless defeated in the city of Peter Obi, a relative newcomer who mobilized the support of many young people, especially in urban areas, shaking up the country's two-party system. In an acceptance speech, Tinubu thanked voters and said he was profoundly humbled. He also appealed to his fellow contestants, asking them to team up together to strengthen the country.
This is a shining moment in the life of any man and affirmation of our democratic existence. From my heart, and truly from my heart, I say thank you very much. I take this opportunity also again to appeal to my fellow contestants to let us team up together. It is the only nation we have. It is one country that we must build together. We work together to put broken pieces together. We must work for the unity, happiness, and harmony.
President Muhammadu Buhari is stepping down after 2 terms in office marked by economic stagnation and growing insecurity around the country, from an Islamist insurgency in the northeast to a nationwide crisis of kidnapping for ransom and separatist attacks in the southeast. Tinubu now has the task of solving these problems, among others, in Africa's most populous nation and biggest oil exporter. Tinubu's influence is far and wide, from Lagos, where he once governed, to Nigeria's seat of power after he backed the campaign of Buhari in 2015. The trained accountant has repeatedly pointed to his time as Lagos governor to push his campaign. But his promise to fight endemic corruption has been questioned by many opposition supporters, who cite controversies about much of his life, from his finances to his disputed age and health condition. This election was one of the most fiercely contested since the country returned to democratic rule in 1999. Bureau Report, Sansad TV. Nigeria officially became a democracy after its independence from Britain in 1960. However, it has had a fragile and fluctuating democracy since its independence, years that have been dominated by civil war and centralization of power during the military era. But Nigeria has a democratic constitution with a federal system modeled on the United States. The executive is headed by the President, the legislature is formed by the National Assembly of Senate and House of Representatives, and the judiciary is headed by a Supreme Court. Let's now take a look at the parliamentary structure of Nigeria. The federal government of Nigeria has a distinct separation of legislative, executive and judicial powers that are derived from its constitution, the National Assembly and the President. The National Assembly is a bicameral legislature that has two independent chambers, the Senate and the House of Representatives. The Senate, also called the Red Chamber, has 109 senators who represent 3 senatorial districts of each of the 36 states of the Federation. The House of Representatives is known as the Green Chamber that has 360 federal representatives. Each state elects 10 members to the House of Representatives for 4-year terms. Members of the Senate, 3 from each state and 1 from the Federal Capital Territory, are also elected to 4-year terms. The National Assembly of Nigeria is a democratically elected. It makes laws and holds the government of Nigeria to account. Under the 1999 Constitution, executive power is vested in a president who is the head of the state government and a multi-party system. The president is directly elected to a 4-year term and nominates the vice president and members of the cabinet. The House of Representatives is led by the Speaker, who is assisted by the Deputy Speaker and 8 principal officers. The judicial branch is the only one of the 3 branches of government where members are not elected but are appointed. It is made of the Supreme Court of Nigeria, the Court of Appeals, the High Court, and other specialized courts. Laws are based on the rule of law, independence of the judiciary, and the British common law due to the long history of British colonial influence. Thousands took part in a protest rally in Portuguese capital, Lisbon, to demand action from the government on the cost of living crisis. Protesters called for a fairer life and an end to price increases. Let's take a look at this next report. Tens of thousands of teachers took to the streets in Lisbon this week in one of the biggest protests in Portugal in recent years. The socialist government is facing a wave of discontent over the cost of living crisis. For the 3rd time in less than a month, teachers and school workers held mass demonstrations. Earlier, Portugal's biggest umbrella union, the CGTP, held several protests and strikes across the country against raising prices and urged the government to increase workers' pay. On February 25, the movement Fair Life rallied people to protest in Lisbon over the cost of living crisis, home evictions and reduction in salaries. Organizers said an emergency plan from the government is crucial if only to stop a difficult situation from getting worse. Socialist Prime Minister Antonio Costa, who won a majority in parliament, is facing a slump in popularity and street protest after just 1 year, not just by teachers but by other professionals. Portugal is one of Western Europe's poorest countries. Government data shows over 50% of workers earned less than 1,000 euros per month last year. The minimum wage is 760 euros per month. House prices in Portugal rose 18.7% in 2022, the biggest increase in 3 decades. Inflation is close to 3-decade highs. Bureau Report, Sansad TV. Turkey President Tayyip Erdogan indicated on Wednesday that elections will be held on May 14, sticking to his previous plan for the vote with a date just over 3 months after a devastating earthquake killed more than 40,000 people in Turkey. There had been conflicting signals over the likely timings of the presidential and parliamentary elections since last month's earthquake, with some suggesting they could be postponed until later in the year or could be held as scheduled on June 18th. Before the disaster, Erdogan's popularity had been affected by the soaring cost of living and slump in the lira. He has since faced a wave of criticism over his government's response to the deadliest quake in the nation's modern history. Three parties, including the country's second largest, have quit Nepal's coalition government after Prime Minister Pushpa Kamal Dahal Prachand threw his support behind another party's candidate for president. Meanwhile, a defiant Prachand on Wednesday said he will face a vote of confidence and reshuffle his cabinet only after presidential polls. The Nepali Congress and CPN-UML have written to all the parties in parliament seeking votes for their respective candidates for the presidential election on March 9th. It comes a day after CPN-UML withdrew its support to Prime Minister Pushpakamal Dahal Prachand-led government following a rift over backing Podel, the main opposition party's candidate for the presidential poll. Podel and Namwang from the CPN-UML party filed their candidacies last week. Both Podel and Namwang are former speakers of the House of Representatives. Despite the CPN-UML withdrawing support, the Prachand-led coalition government is expected to survive the trust vote in parliament as it has the support of the Nepali Congress, the largest party in the House, with 89 lawmakers. In the 275-member House, the UML has 79 lawmakers, while CPN Maoist Centre has 32. Prachand needs only 138 votes in parliament to continue as the Prime Minister. Slipping into a very short break here, we'll be back with more news on democracies of the world. You stay tuned to Sansad TV for more news. Welcome back. After the break, you're watching our special program, Democracies of the World. Moving on, Israelis have stepped up their protest against the government plan to overhaul the judicial system. The protests come as the government barrels ahead with the legal changes, with the parliamentary committee moving forward on a bill that would weaken the Supreme Court. The Knesset is also set to cast a preliminary vote on a separate proposal to protect Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu from being removed from his post over calls that he cannot serve as premier while on trial for corruption. Protesters blocked the main highway between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem on Wednesday, halting rush hour traffic for about an hour. In response, National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir called on police to prevent the road blockages. Thousands of protesters came out in locations across the country waving Israeli flags. The legal overhaul has sparked an unprecedented uproar with weeks of mass protest, criticism from legal experts, business leaders and the security establishment, as well as concern from international allies.
I'm here to protest about this dictatorship revolution, about the attempt to change the judicial system, the legislative system, and the executive branch. And we're here to fight about our right to live in a true democracy.
Every person here is trying to keep Israel a democracy. And if the current government will get its way, then we are afraid that we will no longer be a democracy or a free country. Me as a woman, as a mother, I'm very scared for my family and for my friends.
And now news coming in from Baghdad. Hundreds of protesters took to the streets in Baghdad to voice their dissent against a draft election law that would increase the size of the country's electoral districts. The current law under which the 2021 elections were held breaks each of the country's 18 provinces into several electoral districts. The law, which was a key demand of the hundreds of thousands of protesters who took to the streets in the late 2019, was seen as giving independent candidates a better chance of winning. Last week, Parliament debated a draft law that would return Iraq to having one electoral district per governorate. Independent MPs who objected to the proposal walked out of the session, which ended early due to the losing quorum. The Parliament is set to discuss the proposed law again on March 6th, but were not expected to vote on the proposal. The protest took place in the presence of a heavy presence of security forces around the Parliament and closure of the Jamhuria Bridge that leads to the government areas of the Green Zone. Moving on, huge crowds gathered across Mexico this week to oppose a government drive to shrink the Independent Electoral Authority. The demonstrators argued that the changes threaten democracy in what appeared to be the largest protest yet against President Andrés Manuel López Obrador's administration. In what appeared to be the largest protest so far against President Andrés Manuel López Obrador's policies, huge crowds gathered in Mexico over the weekend to condemn moves to shrink the electoral authority deemed by protesters as a threat to democracy. Anti-government demonstrators shouted slogans against Mexican president during a march in Mexico City main square, the Zocalo. The marchers were clad mostly in white and pink, the color of National Electoral Institute. Mexico's Congress on February 22nd approved a major overhaul of the National Electoral Institute. Once enacted, they would cut salaries, funding for local election officers, and training for citizens who operate and oversee polling stations. They would also reduce sanctions for candidates who fail to report campaign spending. Mexico's president denies the reforms as a threat to democracy and says criticism is elitist, arguing the institute spends too much money. He says the funds should be spent on the poor. According to many political analysts, the INE and its predecessor played a key role in creating a pluralistic democracy that in 2000 ended decades of one-party rule. López Obrador, a 69-year-old who contends he was robbed of the presidency twice before he finally romped to a crushing victory in the 2018 election, argues the INE is too expensive and biased in favor of his opponents. The institute denies this. Mexican presidents may only serve a single 6-year term. According to the INE, the president's overhaul violates the constitution, curbs the institute's independence, and eliminates thousands of jobs dedicated to safeguarding the electoral process, making it harder to hold free and fair elections. López Obrador has also weakened other autonomous bodies that check his power on the grounds that they are a drain on the public purse and hostile to its political project. He says his INE shakeup will save $150 million a year. Bureau Report, Sansad TV. Thousands of workers in Sri Lanka staged a one-day strike to protest against massive increases of taxes and electricity rates by the government on Wednesday. Around 2,000 workers held a demonstration outside a port during their lunch break in the commercial capital, Colombo. Most banks across the country were also closed for the day, and parts of a hospital were closed as other unions participated in the strike. Sri Lanka had raised electricity prices by 66% on February 16 in a move the government hopes will persuade the International Monetary Fund to provide a bailout for its crisis-stricken economy, and also introduced new income taxes in January for professionals ranging from 12.5% to more than 36%.
We are not in a position that we can't pay tax. We are in a position we want to pay tax, but in a reasonable amount. This amount is not reasonable. That's why we are telling government should amend this tax policy. Otherwise, we will go for another strike or another major action, maybe a continuous strike.
And now moving on, hundreds of Congolese are fleeing their homes as rebel group linked with neighboring Rwanda seize more territory in conflict-ridden East Congo. As M23 rebels captured the village of Mushaki in North Kivu province after more than 2 days of fighting with government forces and militias last week, a fresh wave of civilians is heading towards the provincial capital Goma to seek shelter in camps. On foot, motorbikes and bicycles, they carry what they can of their belongings. Fighting in eastern Congo has been simmering for decades as more than 120 groups fight for power, land and valuable mineral sources, while others try to defend their communities. But it spiked in late 2021 when M23 rebels, which was largely dormant for nearly a decade, resurfaced and started capturing territory. The fighting has internally displaced more than 5 million people and is driving civilians to starvation, according to the aid groups. And that's all we have in this edition of our program, Democracies of the World. Connect with us on various social media platforms for all the latest from around the world. Thank you for staying in. Stay tuned for more informative programs on Sansad TV. Till then, goodbye, namaskar.